Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 100. D-Day 80th Anniversary. Gold, Omaha, and more. More great, unpublished history. Enemy shells were landing on the shore, bullets raking the sand. The helmsman shouted, 100 to go. Ready, 50 to go. 25 yards. I don't expect there was a man amongst us who thought we'd leave here alive, but I for one had not given up hope. Small caliber shells or mortars were constantly exploding in the water, and splinters were thumping on the sides of our craft. The first Tommy truck sank up to its front axles in shingle and sand, because in the confusion they'd forgotten to lay out the rolls of wire mesh. Hello again, and another exciting World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheall, son of Bill Cheall, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to share family stories, memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. This is going to be a very special one-off episode to commemorate the events of D-Day, 6th of June 1944. There's so much going on at the moment around the 80th anniversary of D-Day that I couldn't resist doing a short episode with a recap of some of the action we've heard in previous episodes. That intro passage was taken from my dad's book, and I'm shortly going to share the full description of his landing. After that, I'm going to share some new material with you, an extract from American William Hershel Nelson's story of landing on Omaha. Then we've got Royal Navy wireman Eric Clarke's account on board a landing craft transporting troops and tanks to the Normandy beaches. Following that, I'm going to read Engineer Sergeant Brian Moss's account of landing on Gold Beach with the 5th East Yorks. Just before we start, I'll set the scene for the D-Day invasion by sharing the words my dad said in his memoirs. We were on our way to make history. There was to be no more waiting, no more exercises. This was it. This was the big battle, 6th of June, 1944. And we were going to give the enemy something to contemplate. So here's Dad's memoir, landing on Gold Beach with the 6th Green Howards. My ship was called Empire Lance. We had tiered bunks, and after we'd stored all our gear, we sat around chatting, putting the war situation into perspective. As far as I can recall, our gear consisted of our .303 Lee Enfield rifle, or in my case a 2-inch mortar and 6 bombs. We all carried in our equipment pouches 2 filled Bren gun magazines, 28 rounds in each, in case there was a hold-up in the supply chain. 3 hand grenades, a bandolier of 50 rounds of .303 ammunition, an entrenching tool, a filled water bottle, a gas cape and ground sheet, gas mask, a full small pack and our webbing equipment, plus bayonet and steel helmet. Section leaders carried a Sten gun. If anybody had spare capacity, more ammunition was carried because nobody was certain how things would go once we'd landed, and we were moving into uncharted waters against a formidable enemy. After 3 days of almost claustrophobic conditions, the tannoy system came to life, telling us to pay utmost attention. Our commanding officer then proceeded to speak. You could have heard a pin drop. No longer were we going to be kept in the dark. It was to be France. That moment made the deepest impression in my mind. Our battalion would be landing on a 3-mile stretch of beach between Le Hamel and La Riviere, having the code name King, on the coast of Normandy, on a 60-mile front. At last we knew. The whole attack from the sea would run from west to east, with the Americans on Omaha Beach on our immediate right, and Utah on our far right. The British were on Gold Beach, the Canadians on Juno, and the British again on Sword. At 0500 hours the ship heaved to. It was just starting to become light. We were now standing waiting for further orders, almost weighed down with equipment, ready for the fray. Suddenly, "Come on lads, let's go," from our officer, reminded me very quickly why I was there. It was time. I found myself with my leg over the side of the ship, trying to get a footing onto the scrambling net. I'd fastened the mortars and bombs onto my equipment, and my number 2 on the mortar was alongside me. The practice we'd done for this day was nothing like the real thing, and endeavouring to get a foot onto that landing craft was beset with danger. The sea was very rough, and there was a 3-foot rise and fall of the craft against the side of the ship. It was a hair-raising experience, but luckily nobody suffered any injuries. Somehow we made it, and pulled away from Empire Lance, and then waited until all assault craft were in line abreast. There were 14 assault craft to land on Gold Beach, with 30 men in each. As soon as we were all settled on the bench seat, the order came, "Craft away." We were only 7 miles from our objective. The whole operation was fantastic. The sea seemed to be covered with ships of every description. The run-in was to take 2 hours, and our H-hour was 0725 hours, with the Americans on our right, and, because of the differences in the tide, they had started their invasion at 0630 hours. God help us, lads. Looking around us, we could see other assault craft taking station at each side of us. The sea was very choppy, but as the mist began to clear and the light was improving, the whole mighty operation became visible to us. And what a sight it was, something nobody had ever seen before. The mind could not absorb the enormity of it all. There were thousands of ships of all sizes, and standing out like huge sentinels, the mighty warships. In fact, almost 7,000 ships in all. The extent of what we were taking part in is difficult to describe in great detail. It was such a vast undertaking that nobody, not even the participants who were part of it, could describe the invasion adequately enough and as vividly as we saw it happen. It would never be seen again in our lifetime, so many ships in one place at one time. Shells started to come towards us, but the enemy seemed to be going for the ships, not us, and they created great spouts of water when they hit the sea. The gunners had not found their range. Now we could see bombs falling from our planes and fighters, skimming low above the enemy defenders. The continuous thundering was never ending. We were about 2 miles from the coastline, Rommel's Atlantic Wall, when on our port side we saw something which we had never seen before. It was a rocket ship about half a mile away from us, and it was firing a massive, continuous barrage of missiles, screeching simultaneously, dead straight towards the coast. We could hear, almost feel, the heat generated by the displaced air. Hell, we said, fancy being on the end of that lot. It was fantastic, and the bombardment was something the enemy could not have imagined it was possible to be on the receiving end of. We could hear the rumble of war as the planes dropped their bombs. Warships were shelling the fortifications, and the sound of the shells flying above us was uncanny. Great flashes were coming from the gun barrels and lit the morning sky. The battleships were firing their salvos of shells, which we could hear screaming above our heads. And above them, the planes, a never-ending stream of planes of all sorts, was going to bomb the communications inland so the Germans could not send for reinforcements. It seemed to be a hell of a long way to the beach. Then I saw a landing craft next to ours slow down. A bullet must have hit the helmsman. Swiftly, somebody took over control, but the boat was now a little out of line with the other assault craft, and in the blinking of an eye, the front of the boat had been hit by a shell or mortar, or probably a mine. The explosion lifted bodies and parts of bodies into the air, and the stern of the craft just ploughed into the sea. All those boys, laden with kit as they were, didn't stand a chance of survival. There was so much happening now, and so swiftly, every second was vital. Let's get out of this coffin. Enemy shells were now landing on the shoreline, and machine gun bullets were raking the sand. Then, at the top of his voice, the helmsman shouted, 100 to go. 75 to go. Already 50 to go. 25 yards. And suddenly, ramp going down, now. And the craft stopped almost dead in 3 feet of water. And our own platoon commander shouted, "Come on, lads!" And we got cracking. That was no place to be messing about. Get the hell out of it. Jumping off the ramp, we went into waist-deep water, struggling to keep our feet. We waded through the water looking for mined obstacles, holding rifles above our heads. I was trying to keep a very cumbersome 2-inch mortar and bombs dry, as well as making certain I didn't drop it. Some of the lads were shot as they jumped. 2 of them were a bit unfortunate, because as they jumped into the boiling water, the craft surged forward on a wave, and they fell into the sea. I dare say they would fight like hell and recover, but we were not hanging about. That had been our instructions from the start. We must not linger. Our adrenaline was now at its peak, and every one of us was aware of what he had to do. At the moment, there was no actual fighting to be done, as there was no visible enemy, but we had to get off that beach and forward in order to come into contact, because they were hidden in their positions. Our primary concern was to get out of the sea. Onto the soft sand, and the boys in front and behind of me went down. Hell, get moving! Halfway up the beach, about 10 yards from the sand dunes, I saw an amphibious Sherman flail tank at a standstill, its chains hanging helpless like some monster. One track was off its sprockets. It had gone into the assault on the beach before us to make a path through the minefield which ran along behind the beaches. The crew had bailed out and had continued under fire to make a path across the minefield, and had taped it. On the beach, lads were falling all over the place. Resting with his back against the tank was our company commander, Captain Lynn, who'd been wounded. He was waving his arm for us to get off the beach. Tragically, while he was in that position, he was hit again and killed. Our platoon commander, Captain Chambers, now took over, and he too was wounded, but was able to carry on his duties. He was shouting and waving his arms, "Get off the beach! Off the beach! Off the bloody beach! Get forward, lads, and give the buggers hell!" That was his natural leadership coming to the surface, though we did not need any urging, because we knew that enemy machine guns and mortars would have previously been set up on fixed lines to cover the beach, and were now playing havoc with us. It was difficult to make too much haste on the soft sand, but by a supreme effort we ran up the slope towards the sandbanks in face of heavy enemy fire. Dead and wounded lads lay all over the beach. You're in for a treat now because you haven't heard this before. You heard from William Hershel Nelson, Private First Class, in the last episode, covering his dramatic adventures fighting inland beyond the beaches. And right now I'm going to backtrack a little and share some of his Omaha beach landing experience. And this is taken from the BBC People's War website. The trials and tribulations of a D-Day landing on Omaha Beach. And it's also published in a memoir called The Untold Story by William Hershel Nelson. And there's a link in the show notes. The mist began to clear, and one was able to see the brightness of the sun just clearing the edge of the horizon. This was where we'd heard the machine guns. The Germans were shooting at the first wave of landing ship tanks to try landing on the beach. They were shooting everything but the kitchen sink at us. 2 boats to the right of ours were blown completely out of the water, leaving debris and parts of bodies floating on the sea. It would be impossible for me to describe the yells of pain and the death cries of the wounded, and to make matters worse, there was nothing we could do about it, for we were all the intended target. The soldiers in the LST with me were extremely lucky, for if our boat had been in the first wave, all the men would have died. Every so often I could hear an explosion nearby and see pieces of metal fly into the air. Shells were still hitting the LSTs everywhere along the ocean. Everybody in the boat was thinking, when will it be our turn? The sun became quite light, and we saw a haze of smoke as one of the craft floated in flames on the sea. We were getting closer to the brownish-white sands, and we could make out the barbed wire and sea defences, and pieces of something white caught up in the wire. We were that close I also heard the hissing noise as the sea ran through the uprights holding the wire in place. We actually touched the wire, then all hell broke loose. The gunners on shore had homed in on the boat I was in, and all at once the front of the landing craft disappeared, breaking in half, and also detonating booby traps hanging from the wire, killing nearly everybody at the front, and leaving everyone still alive trying to save themselves from drowning. I do believe that someone that day was looking after me. If I'd been sooner rather than later in boarding the LST, I would have been sitting at the front rather than the back, and would not be here to tell the tale. The boat, as it broke in half, flattened the barbed wire, leaving me in the water up to my neck, but just able to reach the bottom of the sand on tiptoes. Without doubt I must have swallowed a quart of water that day. The dead were floating all around me, and I had to push them away as I and a few of my buddies made our way towards the sands. I'd lost my rifle, but at least I was alive. About a dozen of us in the LST that I was in survived and finally made it to the end of the waterline to throw ourselves down among the many dead bodies which had been washed up by the wind-swept sea. Just beside me, and huddled in a ball, was a young soldier I'd seen praying, and he seemed to be crying like a baby boy. I lay amongst the dead. In fact, I played dead, for it didn't take too much working out what the machine gunners were doing. As each craft came somewhere near the sands, and as the fronts of their boats fell down, the gunners, laying in their concealments on the shoreline, machine-gunned the crafts, killing or wounding everyone on board. This had not happened to the LST I was on, for the artillery shell had found our boat, and the soldiers in the sea were not very good targets. Looking along the beach, we could see many landing craft still unloading men, and as they unloaded, many of the young men died, and there were corpses everywhere. The Germans were having a picnic, for every LST missed by the artillery had the machine gunners to reckon with. I think another thing that saved us from disaster was that so many craft arrived on the beach before ours. So you could say we were the lucky ones, for the boat I was on was probably 3 minutes behind, and this very likely saved a few lives. The last command we were to receive when we made the landing was, "Take no prisoners." But it began to look as if no one would be around to take any. How the hell could we take prisoners if we saw none? All day long, early morning till late afternoon, we were held on this beach, and all day long we received many casualties. The most annoying thing about this landing came later, after the war. The planes we all heard during the night never did hit their targets. The bombs dropped were supposed to leave craters on Omaha Beach. If this had happened, countless lives would have been saved. We'd have had cover of a kind, and God knows we needed it. My leg was paining me, aching like hell, and I turned on my side and put my hand down to touch something very wet on my leg. Looking at my open hand, I found it was covered in blood. At first I felt frightened, but glancing at my leg, I saw the wound was only minor. Ripping a piece of grey cloth from the barbed wire nearby, I wrapped it tightly around the open wound. Then, looking back along the coast, I realised now how lucky the group around me was, for all one could hear was cries for help and yells of severe pain. God, it was a nightmare. Bodies were floating in the sea as far as I could see. On this day, I would suppose 1 man in every 20 reached the beach alive, but at least these men stood a chance of survival. By this time, I think everyone around me was feeling frustration. Everyone knew he could not help his chums, only listen to the voices that gradually faded away. I could only tell about my own journey from the water to my present place of safety, and to describe it again would be reliving a nightmare. I don't expect there was a man amongst us who thought we'd leave here alive, but I for one had not given up hope. The day slowly crept into afternoon, and still there was no let-up, only more bodies on the sands. It seemed like hours had passed, but we were gradually reaching our destination, a large wooden triangle that lay near the beach edge. Then, all at once, we were out of sight of the enemy, and were able to rest, for the position we were in was safe, and while I rested, I was able to silently say a prayer. There was one incident that pleased me, for as I rolled onto my side, I found my best friend staring at me. "Are you okay, buddy?" he said. "Wait until we get to a place of safety, then ask me again," I replied. We were having quite a conversation, mostly about the situation we were in. Then a cry of someone in pain was heard, and looking back the way we came, there lay a man with half his arm cut off. Without thinking, the two of us rose up and ran back toward the wounded soldier, quickly picked him up, and hurried back to the shelter we'd occupied. We were able to stop the bleeding, put him in a comfortable position, and hope to God the medics would soon be on the scene. There were many a lesson I learned in the forces, but the one that was most important was my understanding of the meaning of patience and this stood me in good stead all my army term. In my training, I never once refused to carry out an order, although this did not mean that I agreed with every command I received, but nevertheless I did as I was ordered. Officers, sergeants, and even corporals were there to be respected, but I found the ones who were in charge were the very first to die during the landing at Omaha. The uncanny thing about this was they taught the whole company on the art of survival, yet they were the first casualties. You can hear what happened to a hero beyond the beaches in the previous episode 99, Omaha Heroes. This next segment is from Eric Clarke about a landing craft tank. Vicky Zaruski-Hewitt from Cambridge, UK, kindly sent me this story a while back from her dad. He wrote the memoir based upon his most amazing experiences aboard a landing craft transporting troops and tanks to the Normandy beaches. This is written by Eric Ernest Clarke, who was a leading wireman in the Royal Navy. Early 6th of June, we received orders to sail to Normandy. The weather was still bad, with heavy sea swells making headway and steering difficult to stay in formation. Most landing craft needed special handling during bad weather because of their flat bottoms and shallow draft, especially landing craft tanks because of the length and flat loading ramp. They would buck and judder with a screw action, and in certain sea swells they'd leave the sea and pancake down hard, often with the stem in the air with the propellers exposed, causing the main engines to race away. By the time we neared the Normandy coast, most of our soldiers aboard were showing signs of fatigue due to lack of sleep and sickness, but they put on a brave front. All around, the sea was littered with ships of all types, coming and going in all directions. Big warships were shelling over the coastline. Smaller warships were buzzing around them with loud hailers, blasting away, and numerous assault craft everywhere. The noise from the big navy guns and machine guns and the stench from smoke and cordite was overpowering. As we neared the beach, we had to break formation, and each craft was left to its own salvation. I believe we should have beached on Sword Beach, but because of obstructions on the shore, we actually beached on Juno near Cheall. It was difficult getting in because we had to allow enough distance to drop our kedge anchor before beaching in order to pull ourselves back off. And apart from the obstructions and damaged craft, there were also rows of constructed obstacles on the beach line, some of which exploded on impact. However, we managed to drop our 7-ton loading ramp, and the soldiers started to disembark with their armour. The first Tommy truck sank up to its front axles in shingles and sand, because in the confusion they'd forgotten to lay out the rolls of wire mesh, so it was all hands to drag it back aboard. Meanwhile, all sorts of missiles were flying about. The beachmasters were shouting, our barrage balloon deflated, and the cable dropped and tangled on the vehicles in the well deck. It was a shambles, and our captain was shouting at me to cut the cable free and stand by the capstan, which was our aid for winding in the kedge anchor in order to pull us off the beach. When the 6 tanks and Tommy trucks were finally unloaded, we waved our Royal Artillery soldiers and tank crews lots of good luck, then fortunately managed to pull our craft off the beach. Our kedge anchor had gripped well. We turned about and headed back to New Haven to reload with more army units. We did this journey 3 times to near enough the same area of the Normandy beach, and each time there was more and more obstruction on the beach shoreline. Damaged landing craft, tanks, lorries, piled up enemy metal, fences and structures, which we learned later were called Belgian gates. Also, quite a lot of the damaged and abandoned vehicles were Canadian. During the 3rd beaching, we were hailed back to the beach and took aboard around 150 to 200 German prisoners, which we unloaded at Portsmouth. They gave us quite a problem because there was nowhere they could sleep except in the well deck. They had no buckets for their necessaries, and we had no food to offer them since we ourselves were eating stale bread with mouldy green baked beans. We managed another 5 trips back and forth, but on these occasions we unloaded on Gold Beach, Arromanches. The last couple of journeys we landed inside or on the Mulberry Harbour. Over to Brian Moss now in 233 Royal Engineers. His memoir has been covered in the show when it was just a family story, and his son Mike has since got the book published by Pen and Sword in Mines, Bombs, Bullets and Bridges, a sapper's Second World War diary. And what a masterpiece of a story that is. There's a link in the show notes. You can hear more about Mike's astonishing war in episodes 2, 3 and 13, and his book has been very well titled as he fights as well as blows up tank ditches and dismantles UXBs in 1940s London. Our objective, La Rivière, had been intimately described to us over the past few weeks. All place names were coded, of course. We'd been shown photographs of the place, but we had no idea where it was. However, one day, one of our lads had suddenly said that he knew exactly where it was. He'd been on holiday there. He was immediately led away, and we never saw him again. Behind the very end of the seawall, the enemy had constructed an immense concrete casemate. It was designed to fire along the beach to the west, thus catching anyone attempting to advance up the beach anywhere up to a mile away. We'd been told that it held an 88, a 50mm and automatic weapons. It was practically invisible from the sea, neither could it be accurately fired upon by our navy, nor could the casemate's guns fire towards the sea. My personal plan was rather different to the brigade plan. I could not see how men could be put across the beach in view of the enfilading fire from the casemate. I personally intended to make straight for the casemate, approaching it directly from the sea. In this way, I would only have to dodge all the other automatic weapons firing at me from trenches and so on. I'd be reducing the odds, so to speak. 5th East Yorks were also on our ship, and I knew their company sergeant major. After thinking about the casemate, I visited him during the afternoon of June the 5th. "Got any spare grenades?" I asked. He gave me 2 boxes of the 36 Mills type grenade. They were thickly varnished and bore paint splotches in red. "They're fused, mind you. Set for 4 seconds, he warned. I made an unofficial issue of grenades to all my men who wished to carry them. I kept 4 for myself, carrying 2 in each trouser pocket. Our leaders had spoken glibly of the 88 position. They assured us it would be put out of action long before we got there, but we had heard this sort of thing before and did not believe it. Our Marines cast off the falls, and we were free of our mothership. Goodbye, Empire Rapier. We shall never see you again, I thought. Sitting uncomfortably upon my folding bicycle, I stared across at the East Yorks on the port side bench. Between us, in the middle, the men in the centre row sat facing forward, straddling their bench. Second Lieutenant White sat at the head of the central row alongside me. He looked young. The sea was quite lumpy, with waves running about 4 feet high. One moment you could see a ship, and the next moment it disappeared from sight. Very soon vomit bags were in heavy use. The LCA had a double frame filled with foam concrete, which it was said would float. The sides of the craft were about 2 feet in thickness, and it was onto this flat upper surface that a man would spring, had he neglected to visit the heads before embarking. Squatting upon his bucket, he became the target of many jibes from our little flotilla. Our heavy ships fired at the beach, with the sounds of scores of express trains hurtling overhead. We could not see over the side from our seats. Now and then I stood up to take a quick look. Second Lieutenant White dared not scold me, but he had plenty to say to his own men if they tried to do this. One Marine was stationed directly in front of me in an armoured steel box with vision slits. He steered the craft and would let the ramp down when we beached. The other 2 Marines were at the stern, managing the engines. Our little group of landing craft assault, LCAs, was drawing away from the massive shipping, and was steadily plugging away for the land, now visible some 5 miles away. Several other small groups of LCAs could be seen to port and starboard, but not many, it seemed. Not nearly as many as I would like to have seen. A destroyer moved in very near to us and cut loose with its main armament. It blasted salvos at the 88 position and hit the houses beyond. They collapsed in smoke and flames. Other craft and rocket ships were pouring a drenching fire upon the beach defences, which lay under a heavy pall of smoke. The rumble of explosions never ceased and was getting louder and louder as we approached. To my right, I was surprised to see a Marine taking cover behind the stern of an LCA. He was hanging oddly over the stern, so that only the upper part of his body was clear of the water. Many months later, I read of a Marine, Corporal George Tandy, who had been decorated with the DSM, the Distinguished Service Medal, for having steered his craft all the way into the beach with his feet. The steering gear of his LCA had apparently been damaged as the craft was released from the ship. He was dubbed the human rudder, and I thought he was taking cover. The East Yorks were getting excited, and many started to look over the side. Second Lieutenant White said nothing about this now. A shell exploded 50 yards off our port side. I ducked as splinters thumped our craft, and we were drenched with drifting spray. Our LCA travelled those last few yards in a space of time that seemed immeasurable, almost in slow motion. Small calibre shells or mortars were constantly exploding in the water, and splinters were thumping on the sides of our craft. I watched the Marine in his armoured box in front of me. From his activity, I judged that we were getting close. The thunderous noise drowned voices and the firing of individual weapons. The engine slowed, and suddenly the craft bumped on the sand. We had arrived. Down went the ramp with a crash, and the armoured doors flew open. Immediately a burst of automatic fire crackled in just above our heads. No one was hit. With a yell, Second Lieutenant White sprung to his feet and jumped out into the knee-deep water. To our surprise, he disappeared from sight. He'd fallen into a shell hole, obscured by the water. Two stalwarts reached down, seized his shoulder straps and threw him onto the beach, after which the centre row of men charged out. When I saw that the port side row of men had also got out, I jumped up, threw the silly folding bicycle away over the side, and set off down the ramp at high speed, shouting to my fellow sapper to follow me. On reaching the sand, I turned half left and aimed directly for the end of the sea wall. I glanced behind me. The bulk of East York's troops were beginning to arrive, and these men were running straight up the beach. The machine guns tore into them. Above the crackling in the air, I could hear the dull thuds of bullets striking bodies, reminding me of the noise made by a carpet beater hitting a damp carpet hung out on a clothesline. I ran as fast as possible, threading my way between the beach obstacles. I had about 500 yards to go to reach the end of the beach. My slanting course was also taking me 400 yards to the left, to the end of the seawall. As I flew along, I felt no fear. I must have been burning up all my nervous juices as fast as they were being secreted. In front of me, a bundle of old rags raised its weary head from the sand. It was Johnny Halliday. Landing just before me, Johnny had been hit. Contrary to orders that said we must stop for nothing, I did stop and bent down to look at him. There was a small wound in the top of his left shoulder. It could have been a superficial wound, but if it were a bullet obtained when he was lying down, facing the enemy headlong, then it would likely have penetrated his whole body, and there'd be no hope for him. All I could do was give him an encouraging word before I raced on, quickly getting into top gear again. I never saw Johnny again, and my attempts after the war to trace his fate were unsuccessful. That's Johnny Halliday, H-A-L-L-I-D-A-Y. Anybody know anything about him? Within a few yards, I was surprised to meet two screaming naked men making for the water at high speed. They were hairless, burned bright blue, and wore only smoking boots. I assumed they were a tank crew. We passed on opposite courses with never a second glance. I then picked my way through a zone where many bodies lay. These were evidently machine gun victims, in numbers approaching an entire company. This would have been the left-hand assault company, men who had landed just before us and had felt the full fury of the enemy defence. I sped along, dodging and ducking, the grenades swinging madly in my pockets. There was no sign of 2 platoon at all. I wondered if they were sheltering behind the beach obstacles somewhere. Steel helmet bouncing on my nose, I covered the last few yards and collapsed on the sand next to figures in khaki under the sea wall. Panting like a dog, I was shocked to see only half a dozen men there, just the Yorkie CSM and a handful of his men. Where had our invasion gone? Where was 2 platoon? Where was our officer? Glancing along the beach, I could see no one else on their feet, only the dead and the dying. There were a few figures scuttling about in the distance, but that was all. The CSM threw what I realised was his last grenade over the wall, so I pulled out a couple more from my pockets and handed them to him. "Good lad," gasped the CSM. "Let's give them some more of these buggers." And he sent them over the wall. I hurled my other 2 grenades to join them. I also gave the housetops a squirt from my Sten gun, not because I saw any particular target there, but because it seemed the right thing to do. Enemy fire from the casemate was still pasting the beach. Despite our grenades, its machine guns were firing continuously, while the 88 slammed out round after round. Neither we 8 men at the seawall, nor the enemy in the casemate, could fire directly at each other. If we were to peek around the end of the wall, we would surely get our heads blown off. The grenade was the only weapon that stood a chance of penetrating a doorway or other access point. The few East Yorks lads were tight up against the bottom of that wall. I moved a few yards back, trying to see over the top. Heavy calibre stuff was now dropping on the beach to the west. I turned to look towards where the shells were dropping and was suddenly felled by an almighty blow on the left shin. I found myself kneeling on my left knee and remembered having seen a mortar burst not far away. I knew that I'd collected a mortar fragment. There was no immediate pain, but it gradually built up to the kind of feeling you'd expect to experience if someone hammered a 6-inch nail into your shin bone. I'll now conclude with a gentle, calming epilogue from my dad. His thoughts as D-Day came to a close and the troops settled down for the night. Taking our ground sheet from our pack, we spread it out, then, using our pack as a pillow, covered ourselves with the gas cape. No chance of a blanket. Since we'd had very little sleep for 3 nights, we really should have slept, but it still wouldn't come. The day's events, the horrors, the sadness, the things we'd seen, kept us awake until we were called to go on guard. I opened my eyes as I lay on my back, looking skyward. There was still heavy clouds, so the stars could not be seen. I then closed my eyes and thanked God for watching over me, then prayed to Jesus. The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. The darkness falls at thy behest. To thee our morning hymn ascended. Thy praise shall sanctify our rest. That's the first verse of hymn number 667 in the Methodist hymn book. I then said to myself, O Lord, grant that the souls of our fallen comrades who have given all in battle rest in peace with thee in heaven. Watch over us in the days to come. And I ended by saying the Lord's Prayer. I felt I'd done my duty, so I felt better and drifted into a restless sleep. That's your lot. He's wishing you a great 6th of June, D-Day 80, however you choose to commemorate it. And if you have no other plans, I hope this episode's helped you to carry out your own personal commemoration in some small way. I'm going to be at the Greenhowards Museum in Richmond, Yorkshire for a very special day, so I hope to share something of that with you at some point. And at this very minute, I'm probably at a very early morning church service, followed by a hearty breakfast. Hopefully something other than bully beef and hardtack biscuits. If you feel moved to listen to the full episodes pertaining to all the passages I've shared, I've put details in the show notes. I'd like to leave you with an important message, one that I've shared before, and it's particularly for younger listeners. Just bear in mind, the German people are no longer the enemy. Despite stuff you might have heard in this memoir, please remember that every bit of it is in the past, and it happened 80 years ago and counting. hatred and grudges heal with time, and I can't ever recall my dad saying anything that amounted to hate against the Germans, even if he might have thought that plenty of times during the war. If you want to hear a bit more about the German perspective on the fighting, you've got to catch up with my earlier episode, Through German Eyes. Highly recommended and one of my most popular. I hope that's given us all a lot of food for thought about what our fathers, grandfathers and even great-grandfathers went through to secure the rights and freedoms that we enjoy today. Let's not spurn them. There's a great cartoon featured in the episode artwork from the Mirror newspaper. There's a copy of it in Dad's box of souvenirs. It's a picture of a weary, bruised and bandaged soldier holding a laurel crown labelled Peace and Victory in Europe, and he's saying, "Here it is, and don't lose it again." I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now.